Tonight on Primetime, Israel and Lebanon have held direct talks in Washington, marking an unusual step in a relationship long defined by hostility and indirect contact. With tensions running high across the region, the meeting signals a cautious attempt to give diplomacy a fighting chance. Talking peace then, or testing the waters? Good evening. A diplomatic breakthrough or simply a pause in the cycle. Israel and Lebanon are talking in Washington, but with violence ongoing and demands unchanged, the gap remains significant. Here's more.
The United States hosted rare direct talks between Israel and Lebanon in Washington, D.C., marking a significant diplomatic moment between two countries that have technically been at war for decades. The meeting comes at a critical point in the Middle East crisis, just 1 week into a fragile ceasefire involving the United States, Israel and Iran. Chaired by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the talks brought together Israeli Ambassador Yechiel Leiter and Lebanese Ambassador Nada Hamadeh. Israel is demanding the disarmament of Hezbollah and the dismantling of its infrastructure, while Lebanon is calling for an immediate ceasefire and urgent steps to address a worsening humanitarian crisis. Officials say the talks lasted more than 2 hours. The US State Department described the discussions as productive, with agreement to move toward direct negotiations. Rubio called the meeting a historic opportunity to address long-standing tensions.
We're very honored to be joined by two countries that the United States wants to have strong relations with, and we're obviously very happy to serve in this facilitating role. This is a historic opportunity. We understand we're working against decades of history and complexities that have led us to this unique moment. And the opportunity here, I know some of you are shouting questions about ceasefires. This is a lot more than just about that. This is about bringing a permanent end to 20 or 30 years of Hezbollah's influence in this part of the world, and not just the damage it's inflicted on Israel, the damage it's inflicted on the Lebanese people. We have to remember the Lebanese people are victims of Hezbollah.
Israel emphasized its security concerns.
We made it very clear that the security of our civilians is not up for negotiation. That is understood by the government of Joseph Aoun. And I must say, this was a victory for sanity, for responsibility, and for peace. Because the head of Hezbollah warned the government of Lebanon yesterday not to participate in these talks. And the government of Joseph Aoun bravely said no to Hezbollah. And this is the beginning of a very strong and fortified, consistent battle against Hezbollah. They are weakened as they've never been, and together we'll continue to rid the threat of this Iranian proxy, which is so malign and so malignant in the region.
Despite diplomatic progress, violence continues on the ground. A fire lit up the sky in Tyre following a reported Israeli strike. Lebanese authorities say dozens have been killed in recent attacks as tensions remain high.
Okay, let's bring in our first guest now. Eli Piesh joins us. He is the Director of International Affairs at Israel's Defense and Security Forum. Eli, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good to have you with us tonight on Primetime. Direct talks in Washington are pretty rare between Israel and Lebanon, aren't they? Give us your sense of the significance of this moment.
Historic. This really is, when you're going to mark the demise of Hezbollah, this is going to be one of those markers. It also describes, and it really is a marker of the success of the overall war. This war that in some ways began about 45 days ago, in some ways began back in June when Israel first attacked not Lebanon, but attacked Iran, or you can go even further back to when Hezbollah attacked Israel on October 9th, 2023. All of those are significant moments and have all led us to this point where it's hard to imagine that just 2.5 years after Israel suffered the greatest invasion on its territory since, I guess, the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel now has moved to a point where it's not that it's trying to be victorious over Hezbollah, but as we just pointed out, and as what we just heard, Ambassador Leiter, Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Ambassador Leiter, is saying, this is a really historic moment, and this is something that is unprecedented, extremely warmly embraced in Israel. Israelis are very enthusiastic about the idea of looking at Lebanon not as a border that you can never cross, but that a border that we can go back and forth. I think Ambassador Leiter said that Israelis are used to only putting on a suit of armor in order to go into Lebanon. We're looking forward to wearing business suits, wearing swimsuits, and that would be the way that Israelis and Lebanese, we expect in the future, are going to be able to engage with each other.
Yeah, and we heard Secretary Rubio in a report talking about this being not really about a ceasefire, but a longer-term peace that was the objective. I mean, are you hopeful of that? Do you see signs that actually, rather than some kind of short-term tactical play, this really could be an opportunity for something much more sustainable?
Yeah, that is absolutely the hope in Israel. And I would say I do see signs. Number one is the participation of Secretary Rubio. Secretary Rubio understood from the get-go that this was something that there was enough common ground, that it was worth putting his credibility, obviously his time is needed in many places right now, for him to dedicate the time and effort to host this kind of briefing, this kind of meeting in DC, while so many other things are going on. This demonstrates the significance, the credibility. And I would say even more so, again, one of the comments that Ambassador Leiter said, in the past, Hezbollah has always been able to veto any efforts by the Lebanese government to engage directly with Israel. And that's something that, had it been a couple of years ago, would have been unthinkable. But now, because Hezbollah has been degraded so much, because we're no longer dealing with Nasrallah, we're now dealing with a leader of Hezbollah that is not as widely feared and revered. You start seeing that Lebanon understands what not only does it need to do, but also now that it has the capacity to do it. It's never really had the capacity to separate itself from Hezbollah, and we're not there yet. I mean, it's still going to be quite difficult for Lebanon to separate themselves completely from Hezbollah. But Lebanon has suffered, I would say, even more than Israelis have because of Hezbollah's position, Hezbollah's control over much of Lebanon. And when Hezbollah is removed, then the Lebanese people will be able to breathe a sigh of relief, as will the Israelis.
Yes, indeed. And from Israel's standpoint, what are the key priorities, the critical components that they have in mind going into any direct negotiations with Lebanon right now?
Well, the key is going to be about that there cannot be any kind of real agreement with the state of Lebanon as long as Hezbollah is still standing. As long as Hezbollah is a threat, Hezbollah needs to be completely disbanded, disarmed, and also removed from their status within Lebanese society. They are very involved in many aspects in civilian life, in the financial life, in providing, in overseeing hospitals. That kind of thing is a way, that is how Hezbollah, and frankly, a lot of Iran's proxies have been enabled, and we see that very much in Hamas in Gaza, that they embed themselves in society and make it very difficult for the native people to be able to distinguish between the between the military elements and more friendlier or friendlier side of the terrorist entity, and that's what we need. So look for practical things. I think Lebanon could declare Hezbollah as a terrorist entity, as many countries throughout the world has. That's a very, very difficult thing to do in Lebanon. Frankly, Hezbollah is part of the government. Hezbollah is part of the army right now. So it does take some weeding out, but the writing should be on the wall that Hezbollah, which has been around for over 40 years, has been really a feature and has been funded almost exclusively by Iran, and that the ability of Iran to continue to sustain them, to support Hezbollah, certainly is in question. And I would argue that I think the writing is on the wall. If you're a betting person in Lebanon, you expect that Hezbollah is going to be able to be back and as strong as before. Probably not. This is an opportunity. They all saw what happened just a year ago in Syria. That large and I would say almost terrorist kind of entities, dictatorships, can fall. And what's happening in Lebanon right now seems like it's going along those lines. Lebanon had been a country that was primarily Christian, and that was very much, there was no real reason for there to be constant fights with Israel. It didn't need to be the case. And certainly when there was a takeover after many of the Palestinian Jordanians who were kicked out of Jordan, end up fleeing into Lebanon, that's really when Lebanon started moving in a much more hostile front towards Israel. And that can be resolved. And that is not necessarily native to Lebanon. We have a lot in common. And we have some populations that are common, both in the northern part of Israel, the southern part of Lebanon. There's real reason and there's real optimism that it won't happen tomorrow, but we are in a pathway that hopefully will lead to a very positive resolution.
And Eli, is there some recognition on the part of Israel that the own government in Lebanon has, at the very least, a difficult job to do? I know there's been tension, there's been criticism, but there is a distinction, at least to some degree, between the government and then Hezbollah itself. To what extent is Israel taking a different approach with the government versus just the direct approach with Hezbollah?
Well, clearly Israel has a good sense of the dynamics in Lebanon. Israel's intelligence obviously has decimated, I would say, frankly, humiliated the leadership of Hezbollah a number of times over the last couple of years, the beepers and the pagers being the most famous of them. So Israel has a good grasp on what is happening in Lebanon, understands the capabilities and the limitations of what both the Lebanese government and frankly the Lebanese army can do. There are specific things that that Israel believes that the Lebanese government and military are capable of doing. Understandably, at this point, I would say there's a reason why they haven't done it yet, because it will. Lebanon certainly had a history of civil wars. It's obviously a fear, but at this point, there does have to be more courage. It can't just be, from an Israeli perspective, it can't just be Israel taking all the risk. Ultimately, this is about liberating the Lebanese people. There's a lot of talk over the last few weeks about the Iranian people, the potential of Iran being liberated from the Iranian Republic and the IRGC. There is a moment now for the Lebanese people also to be liberated from Hezbollah. It's going to take some effort on behalf of the Lebanese. Israel had spent a year, largely since the ceasefire with Hezbollah went into effect last December, largely a year without much back and forth, and Israel really limited any kind of maneuvers in Lebanon. But with the outset of this most recent war, started on February 28th, when Hezbollah entered that war, Israel understood exactly what needed to be done. And now through Israel's activities, it really is empowering the Lebanese army. And they're not there yet, but I imagine that it won't be very long before the degradation of Hezbollah, the limitations, will start having the mindset is going to be changed within Lebanon, and they'll start understanding that this is a reality. It may have been a dream for many Lebanese, and for many Lebanese it wasn't a dream, but this is now a reality, whether they like it or not, and you better grasp it. Otherwise, the reality is going to hit them in the face.
And just finally, Mr. Piesh, what would need to happen over the coming days for this to move beyond symbolism, beyond something that's hopeful, into something actually much more concrete?
Yeah, so I would say what needs to happen is we need to see the Lebanese army, the Lebanese government acting more decisively against Hezbollah. I would like to see them doing raids. They know where weapons are being stored. I'd like to see them making arrests, things of that sort. One thing they could do, and they talked about kicking out the Iranian ambassador. They haven't quite done so. There's more that can be done over there. Removing Hezbollah from their civil society, from the education networks, from the healthcare. That's not the same thing as disarming weapons and disarming armed militants. But removing Hezbollah from society is a strong message that that the long-term Lebanese approach is a Lebanon without Hezbollah. There are still sanctions. There's still a way of limiting how Hezbollah gets access to funds, confiscating potential bank accounts that are being used. That should be seen. That Hezbollah should be seen as a threat to the Lebanese state. And I think that once the Lebanese government feels confident and does that, then that will really move things in the right direction. But suffocating the funds that allow Hezbollah to continue and to pay their employees, to pay their soldiers, that really is what needs to happen. And if you see that shift happening, then the military and the security aspects, I think, will be able to develop as well alongside Israel, and also, frankly, supporting Israel. I'll say the first move that Lebanon did is having this discussion, having this meeting with Ambassador Leiter in a formal public capacity yesterday against the wishes of Hezbollah. Continuing with this process against the wish of Hezbollah is going to be critical, not trying to find a way to weasel out, but as long as they continue staying and having these conversations, doing it in a public way, is a way that the Lebanese public will see that they're serious and that their future, there is a potential future that is one without war, without conflict, and also without Hezbollah.
Mr. Piesh, we thank you very much indeed for your analysis and for joining us tonight on Primetime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's bring in our next guest now. Malik Jada joins us from Beirut. He is a political journalist closely following developments on the ground. Malik, very good indeed to see you. Thank you for joining us on Primetime. Well, you're in Beirut. Just give us a sense there of the mood on the ground towards these talks in Washington.
Hello, thank you for hosting me. So first of all, in Beirut, we have two groups of people. We have people who are very happy with what is happening, and they are proud that this is the beginning of negotiations between Israel and Lebanon for the first time since 1993. On the other hand, you have a lot of people who are against what is happening. A lot of Hezbollah supporters, but not just Hezbollah supporters, people from different groups opposing this, especially that these are direct negotiations which are not common in Lebanon, and that the results of the negotiations are not yet clear as well.
Now, Lebanon is calling for an immediate ceasefire, not least to enable humanitarian relief. Just give us your sense of that and the seriousness of the situation.
So the situation is really bad, especially of the country. So last Wednesday in Beirut, there were deadly attacks with hundreds killed in less than 10. In South Lebanon, we have daily attacks that don't stop, not for even half an hour. Ongoing attacks, strikes, Israeli strikes, even artillery shells. There are also ground invasion, which reach in some parts 8 kilometers into Lebanese territory. And, Lebanon, there's more than killed, more than 7,000 wounded, and more than 1 displaced since the beginning of the war.
And of course, at the same time, Israel is pushing for Hezbollah to be disarmed. From where you sit, how realistic is that demand in the current political climate?
I think that this demand is actually something that cannot be done overnight. It needs a lot of time, especially that right now, amid the war, it's complicated for the Lebanese army to continue its disarmament mission that's in September of last year, because it's actually very dangerous for the army to deploy into areas within amid continuous Israeli attacks. And also, of course, Hezbollah's opposition of handing over its weapons, especially north of the Litani River, complicate the mission because it risks sparking a civil strife between the army and Hezbollah.
And how much pressure, we talked with our previous guest about the complexity, the difficulties of governing in Lebanon. How much pressure is the Lebanese government under right now, both internally and externally, as it engages in these talks?
The Lebanese army is actually under lots of pressure. This pressure has been there for a long time, and now it has increased a lot. So Israel is using the military actions in Lebanon to end the negotiating table time, which increased the pressure drastically on Lebanon. And at the same time, Allah is also pressuring the government into not giving Israel, for example, guarantees, but at the same time without anything in return for Lebanon.
Yeah, we're having one or two slight issues with the connection, Malik, but I really do want to just ask you one final question, because I think it's very important. Looking ahead from what you've seen, do people who are there with you in Beirut, do they see this as a genuine opening, or is there still skepticism about whether anything really substantially will change?
So in Beirut, we have said before two groups of people: the people who support it and the people who oppose it. I think both of these groups, they think actually as Israel, they don't think that this will surely lead to peace, because Israel, before there was a ceasefire in Lebanon after 2024, and Israel continued its strikes in Lebanon. So they are not very, they are a bit skeptical that this will happen again, that we will sign a ceasefire and it will get violated once again.
Mr. Jadder, we thank you very much indeed for your analysis and for joining us from Beirut on Primetime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, after the break, we'll take a closer look at Armenia balancing Brussels and Moscow and what that means for fragile talks in the region. Don't go away. A warm welcome back to Primetime wherever you're watching. Now, Armenia is talking to Brussels and Moscow almost at the same time. And that contrast is raising fresh questions about where Yerevan really stands at a moment when talks with Azerbaijan are still moving, but remain delicately balanced. Well, there's also a parallel track here, civil society efforts trying to keep dialogue alive on the ground. But as more external actors step in, the bigger question is whether this helps stabilize the process or quietly complicates it. Well, joining me to discuss this now is AnewZ's Deputy Editor-in-Chief, Orkhan Amashov. Orkhan, as always, great to see you.
Great to see you, Guy.
Very interesting this, isn't it? Armenia talking to Brussels and relatively recently to Moscow as well. Is Yerevan playing both sides here, or simply just keeping its options open?
I think it's the most natural thing in the world for Yerevan to strive and have good relations with both Russia and the European Union at a time where internal situation of the country leaves a lot to be desired in terms of cohesion, but what is happening in Armenia is not unheard of. It's a political battle between two different visions. There are two competing narratives. One narrative is pursued by the current incumbent government, which is widely described as a concept of real Armenia, and that narrative is saying that we're a sovereign country, we have clearly defined borders. Those borders are not really clearly defined because that part with Azerbaijan, the interstate border, should be delimited and demarcated, but we have a vision as to where that border should lie and lies. And we should be protective of that territory. That is what Real Armenia concept says. There's another vision inside Armenia, and that vision is supported by opposition, by three major parties, one of which is supported by Samuel Karapetyan, Russian-Armenian billionaire who's currently in jail, and in relation to whom, without mentioning his name, the President Putin made a reference in early April when he received Prime Minister Pashinyan. And those people are saying that Prime Minister Pashinyan is defeatist. It's a state-organized defeatism, and the 7th of June election should result in his defeat, and this detractors of his opposition should come to power and perhaps renegotiate the terms of the initial agreement with Azerbaijan. So we have this competition. At this stage, what Prime Minister Pashinyan is doing, he's trying to have good relations with both EU and basically with Russia, but his policy is largely, whether we like it or not, whether Russians like it or not, whether his opposition, those political parties which currently form opposition to him, like it or not, is about reducing Russian influence. Because what he's effectively doing is trying to diversify Armenian economy, diversify its economic structure and also its military relationship. That diversification will inevitably lead to the reduction in Russian influence because it's diversifying away from Russia. So Russia will remain, but Russia will be limited. Regarding this particular meeting, it's very important. Lots of important statements made there. We remember just months ago, on the 16th of March, EU Foreign Policy Chief, Guy Shone, said that there's going to be a hybrid response team initiated and launched by EU operating in Armenia before the 7th of June election. And today, on the 15th of April, EU ambassadors in Brussels took a decision to institute this particular mission, and that mission will be called European Union Partnership Mission in Armenia, different to the mission which is currently stationed along the conditional border, and this is part of the EU-Armenia relations, and it's an important and indispensable element of the pre-election landscape, wherein there is a point of view by some Armenian politicians, definitely by those who are in the government and some EU officials, that Russia may try to do something very problematic for the current government.
The EU is stressing its impeccable impartiality. How realistic is that, do you think?
I think that we're not talking about impartiality really. What EU is doing there, EU is doing its level best to further cultivate, entrench, and strengthen the current EU-Armenia strategic agenda. If we go back to history, to early 2010s, for example, or to be more precise, back to 2017, we will see that the current relationship between Yerevan, Armenia, and the European Union is based on a comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement signed back in 2017 and which came into force in 2021. Then we have European Union monitoring mission along the conditional border. A different story, we can reflect upon it later. That mission is going to liquidate itself or move into Armenia, inside Armenia basically, from the conditional border with Azerbaijan. We've got a strategic agenda between EU and Armenia. Basically, what European Union is doing now, helping Pashinyan to win the election. It's very obvious, it's no-brainer. I mean, they've been very clear about that. They have been saying that, I mean, Guy Shone and other EU officials have been saying that Prime Minister Pashinyan needs support before the elections. There will be EPC in Yerevan in a couple of days, not in a couple of days, in 20 days. European Political Community on the 4th or 5th of May. Before that, there will be Yerevan Summit, which is effectively EU Armenia summit. All of those summits, just before the election period, are designed to support Prime Minister Pashinyan, his party, reduce Russian influence, help Pashinyan in terms of his fight against opposition, because opposition is supported by Russia. So basically, when you are helping Pashinyan to deal with information manipulation coming from Russia, with hybrid threats coming from Russia, you're effectively helping Pashinyan against his detractors, and detractors are the opposition. So I think that EU is not impartial really, but EU is doing something very worthwhile and good for Armenia, which is about Pashinyan's victory, because this election, Guy, is incredibly geopolitical. It's between one vision supported by Pashinyan and one vision supported by opposition. And Azerbaijan is, of course, naturally, as a neighbor, as a country which is currently advancing its own peace agenda with Armenia, is impartial. It's not Azerbaijan's affair, it's Armenia's internal affair. But the reality is that if on the 7th of June, as a result of those elections, Pashinyan is defeated, peace agenda between Azerbaijan and Armenia will be slackened. I'm not saying there will be war, as Pashinyan claimed, because Pashinyan is saying that if I lose that election, in September there will be a new war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I don't think that will happen, but I think that peace agenda will be slackened.
And Orkhan, this Moscow-infused rhetoric that you mentioned earlier, this sense in which that if citizens vote for Mr. Pashinyan, they're defeatist, almost. How well is that cutting through and impacting people, do you think?
It's cutting through well in certain sections of Armenian society. In particular, that part of society which supports former presidents, Kocharyan and Sarkisyan. And also, interestingly enough, to a certain extent, it does cut through those layers of Armenian society, which are not exactly pro-Russian by definition. But and we can talk about it later, of course. I was having some communication with Armenian colleagues last week, and I've been talking to some EU foreign policy advisors, and I mean, this is, of course, Chatham House rules apply, but there are certain things we can talk about freely. One of those things is that in Armenia, in Yerevan, the Western-educated, very reasonably well-off people seem to support opposition. It's very interesting. It's very interesting that highly educated, slightly nationalistically oriented people tend to support, and cosmopolitan people in Yerevan tend to support opposition, whereas in the regions, for example, you've got strong support for Pashinyan because people in the region, they felt the benefits of the rule by current incumbent civil contract party. So there seems to be a very interesting process going on. I mean, being cosmopolitan, being based in Yerevan, being Western again, and supporting Russia or Russian sort of mindset is something which I've not really come to terms with in terms of realizing why it's happening. Because similar things happening but in a different way happening in Georgia, for example. Georgian Dream, which is widely described as a pro-Russian party, which I tend to treat with a deal of skepticism because I think that the reality is very nuanced and multi-layered. In Georgia and Tbilisi, the cosmopolitan people support opposition, whereas regions support Georgian Dream. It's effectively vice versa. It's cutting through well through the revenge-driven parts of society and some parts of society which are Western educated, and it's created a new dilemma because you would probably, I'm sure you're surprised by what I said.
Well, I think many people would have assumed the opposite, in fact, the direct reverse of that. So it's fascinating. I mean, could you care to speculate? Why do you think that?
I think it's to do with the fact that Prime Minister Pashinyan himself is sovereignty-oriented person, but many Armenians who still remain unhappy with the outcomes of the 2020 war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, effectively with Azerbaijan recovering its territorial integrity and deoccupying its territories, with this process having finished effectively in September 2023. When you are nationalistic, you treat Pashinyan as an enemy. You believe that he started the war basically by means of being very provocative and then lost Armenian control over certain sections of Azerbaijani territory. For you, Pashinyan's EU pivot or the Washington agreements are peripheral. What matters is a nationalistic sort of ideology which is militating against real Armenia concept. Therefore, you see a melange of Western-educated, wrestling people sort of feeling very sympathetic towards Russia because it is Russia-supported parties which are currently advancing this revenge agenda, because revenge is what is uniting these people. Revenge against outcomes of the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But it's only one section of society. So my explanation is a revenge-driven mentality. That's how I would explain why those people support opposition. It's a very interesting picture, and elections are going to prove to be incredibly, incredibly pivotal.
Yeah, it certainly is. And just going back to the EU for a moment, Orkhan, when you look at the EU, when you look at what they're doing, what they're saying at the moment, are they being helpful towards the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process, or possibly making things more difficult?
The history of EU-Armenia relations and the impact of this relationship on Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process has been very complicated, very multi-layered. There were stages when the feeling in this country, in Azerbaijan, was that EU has been incredibly counterproductive. But I think that sense is changing presently. If we go back to 2022, when Azerbaijan and Armenia in Prague, in the presence of EU Council President Charles Michel, and also French President being part of the process as well, agreed on mutual recognition of territorial integrity and sovereignty, that was a pivotal moment. That moment probably was the beginning of what's happening now. And then there was also, in that Prague declaration, there was another clause, provision, according to which Azerbaijan and Armenia, they effectively agreed on temporary EU mission along the conditional border on the Armenian side. President Aliyev agreed to that mission, but on the Armenian side, not the Azerbaijani side. When that mission, which was temporary in October, became permanent in February 2023, Azerbaijani point of view changed dramatically. Azerbaijan made it very clear that this mission along the border is counterproductive. It treats Azerbaijan as a threat, because when you have a mission, EU mission, however civilian, but still it does entail a certain element of reconnaissance, and you would imagine that there are certain former intelligence officers. Yes. So you treat Azerbaijan, neighboring countries, as a source of threat. Yes. And that's Azerbaijan never agreed with, and that was a cause of threat, the cause of tensions between EU and Azerbaijan. And when in 2024 April, there was a new document signed between EU and Armenia, Azerbaijan treated it as a source of threat to Azerbaijani national interest. But I think that after 8th of August breakthrough, everything has changed. There's a new reality. Peace agreement has been initialed, and according to the one provision of that particular treaty, once the treaty has been ratified, there should be no third-party presence along the conditional border. Effectively, that EU monitoring mission, which caused massive concern in Azerbaijan, will be removed from the conditional border to inside the country, basically, and that perception will fade away. But this particular mission is different to the border mission, and it's called EU Partnership Mission. I don't think it's necessarily going to cause any problem in Azerbaijan, because it's about helping Armenia in the face of in the light of the upcoming elections, about sort of dealing with the Russian threat. And Azerbaijan is naturally, whether Azerbaijan says official or not, is interested in Pashinyan's victory, because that if Pashinyan wins, the peace agenda will continue. Azerbaijan cannot publicly declare that it's interested in Pashinyan winning, but it's a no-brainer. Azerbaijan wants peace agenda to advance, and peace agenda will advance if Pashinyan wins. Therefore, Azerbaijan is unlikely to see in this mission anything against its interests as things stand now.
Orkhan, always a great pleasure to have your analysis. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Okay, after the break, we'll take a look at the top business news stories shaping the day with Andy Mioch. Don't go away. Welcome back to Primetime. Now, Andy Mioch is with us with the very latest business news stories. Andy, what's on your agenda tonight?
Well, Guy, there's a lot of energy related news. Markets are responding to the latest developments surrounding the Middle East war, while governments are crafting their responses to ensure energy security. There's also some news on AI chips as well. So let's get into it. First up, oil prices rose slightly, but hopes for an end to the Iran war are keeping them below $100 per barrel. This comes as U.S. President Donald Trump said talks with Iran could resume over the next 2 days.
Brent crude futures rose to $96 per barrel on Wednesday, and volatility is expected to persist as traders assess ongoing developments in the Middle East and a steady stream of headlines for signs that the conflict could ease soon and traffic through the Strait of Hormuz could resume. The US military said it had fully halted commercial traffic to and from Iranian ports, though shipping data indicated that several Iran-linked vessels continued to transit the strait. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reported that the US Department of Defense plans to deploy an additional 6,000 troops to the region in the coming days, followed by a further 4,200 by the end of the month. Israeli forces also carried out airstrikes on towns in southern Lebanon. These developments come as a second round of talks between the US and Iran is expected in the near term. US President Donald Trump said the conflict is very close to over, adding that Iranian authorities appear willing to reach a peace agreement.
As Middle East tensions drive energy prices higher and disrupt supply chains, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi announced a $10 billion worth plan to help Asian countries procure resources and bolster their stockpiles. The funds are meant to be channeled through state-backed financial institutions.
Japan said on Wednesday it would set up a financial framework worth about $10 billion to help Asian countries secure energy resources as the Middle East conflict has intensified competition to secure oil. The support, aimed at preventing knock-on effects on Japan's own supply chains, would be channeled mainly through state-backed financial institutions such as Japan Bank for International Cooperation and Nippon Export and Investment Insurance. Announcing the plan, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi said the support would be equivalent to as much as 1.2 billion barrels of oil, or about 1 year's worth of crude oil imports by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. She was speaking after a meeting of the Asia Zero Emission Community, a Japan-led initiative aimed at accelerating decarbonization and energy transition in Asia. Compared with Japan, Southeast Asian countries hold smaller oil stockpiles, leaving supplies of crude and petroleum products such as naphtha, a key feedstock for plastics, increasingly tight. A disruption in Southeast Asian production has fueled anxiety among Japanese healthcare providers that rely on Asia for critical supplies such as containers, tubes, and gloves.
Meanwhile, Russia has pledged to continue its vital oil supplies to Cuba, following a recent delivery of some 700,000 barrels. Cuba is experiencing an acute energy shortage after the U.S. halted oil exports from its main ally, Venezuela, and Mexico also ceased its shipments.
Russia will continue helping fuel-hungry Cuba with crucial supplies of oil, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Wednesday. This comes 2 weeks after Moscow sent a tanker with around 700,000 barrels of crude to the Caribbean island. Washington stopped oil exports to Cuba from its main ally Venezuela after capturing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on January 3rd, triggering acute fuel shortages across the communist-ruled island of almost 11 million people. US President Donald Trump has threatened punishing tariffs on countries sending crude to Cuba as he seeks to put pressure on the government. The US later allowed the Russian oil delivery to Cuba, this year's first by Moscow, for humanitarian reasons. Another major supplier, Mexico, halted its shipments. Cuba produces less than a third of the oil it requires. Though it cleared the recent Russian delivery, the Trump administration said it would review further oil shipments to Cuba on a case-by-case basis.
Still with energy, Slovnaft, the Slovak unit of Hungary's oil and gas conglomerate MOL, said that talks are underway with Croatia's pipeline operator JANAF on thorough testing of the Adria pipeline. That pipeline is essential for transporting non-Russian oil to Hungary and Slovakia, a necessity that has grown following the disruption of the Druzhba pipeline.
Slovnaft, the Slovak unit of Hungarian oil and gas group MOL, said on Wednesday there has still been no final agreement with Croatia's pipeline operator JANAF on thorough testing of the Adria pipeline. The pipeline is a key alternative route for non-Russian oil to Hungary and Slovakia, and the importance of it has grown with the stoppage of the Druzhba pipeline and EU efforts to diversify away from Russian oil. Slovnaft's chief executive said on Wednesday that tests of the entire Adria pipeline and in all seasonal conditions were needed to discover whether it had sufficient capacity to serve the two countries as stated by Croatia. The two firms had previously agreed on the testing to start in March, according to MOL.
In artificial intelligence news, Meta and Broadcom have agreed to expand their partnership on custom AI chips through 2029. The collaboration is set to be on chip design, packaging, and networking, with an initial deployment commitment exceeding 1 gigawatt.
Meta will work with chip designer Broadcom to produce several generations of custom artificial intelligence processors under an expanded deal as the social media giant races to build out the computing capacity needed to power AI features across its apps. Tuesday's announcement extends the tie-up until 2029 and includes an initial commitment of over 1 gigawatt of computing capacity, enough to power roughly 750,000 US homes on average. As AI drives a surge in computing demand, big technology companies such as Meta, Google, and Amazon are designing their own chips to reduce reliance on NVIDIA's costly processors. That custom chip boom has made Broadcom one of the biggest winners of generative AI. The company works with clients to develop custom processors and supplies infrastructure software. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg said the tie-up helps build out the massive computing foundation needed to deliver personal superintelligence to billions of people. The company, which last month unveiled a roadmap of 4 new chips, said the initial capacity commitment with Broadcom was the first phase of a sustained, multi-gigawatt rollout. Broadcom's Ethernet networking technology will also be used to connect Meta's rapidly growing clusters of AI computers.
Staying on chips, ASML, the world's largest supplier of chip-making tools, reported stronger than expected first quarter earnings and lifted its 2026 revenue outlook as artificial intelligence boosts demand for its equipment.
ASML reported stronger than expected first quarter earnings on Wednesday. It hit $3.2 billion on sales of $10.3 billion, up from the same period a year ago. The world's largest supplier of chip-making tools also raised its revenue outlook for the year. It comes as the AI boom lifted demand for the firm's equipment. ASML is the only provider of the EUV lithography tools needed to print cutting-edge AI chips for firms like NVIDIA. The stronger forecast strengthens that position. ASML says demand for chips is outpacing supply. The firm said revenue for the year will now be between $42 billion and $47 billion. ASML's shares have risen 40% so far this year with the quick construction of data centers and a shortage of memory chips.
And that's a wrap on the business brief for tonight. And to get back to you, Guy.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. Okay, after the break, we'll take a closer look at the Black Sea Cable project and what it means for energy influence and regional connectivity. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. A major energy project linking the South Caucasus to Europe is gaining momentum, with Brussels now giving it strategic backing. But beyond infrastructure, this is also about influence, access, and the future shape of regional connectivity. Nini Nikolashvili picked up the story.
The Black Sea Submarine Cable Project, a flagship energy initiative linking Georgia to Europe, has now been granted Project of Mutual Interest status by the European Union. This designation places the project under EU energy legislation, unlocking financial, legal, and administrative support while also simplifying permit procedures. The project envisions a 1,155-kilometer high-voltage electricity cable, most of it laid underwater across the Black Sea, connecting the South Caucasus to European power systems. With a planned capacity of 1,300 megawatts, it is designed to transmit renewable energy, particularly from Georgia's growing hydropower sector, directly to European markets. Beyond energy, the cable is widely seen as part of the broader Middle Corridor, a strategic transit route linking Europe and Asia while bypassing Russia. In this context, Georgia strengthens its role as a key transit and energy hub between regions. The initiative is not new. In 2022, Georgia, Romania, Hungary, and Azerbaijan signed a memorandum of understanding to launch the project with strong backing from the EU. It has since been included in the 10-year network development plan of the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, covering 2026 to 2036. For Georgia, the benefits are significant: increased energy exports, stronger integration with European markets, and enhanced geopolitical relevance. For Europe, the project supports diversification of energy sources and strengthens energy security. Importantly, the EU's continued support highlights Georgia's strategic importance, even at a time when political relations between Tbilisi and Western partners remain strained. Preparatory work is now underway, including seabed surveys, with construction expected to follow in the coming years. Nini Nikolaishvili, Tbilisi, AnewZ.
Well, joining us now to delve into this topic is Nika Chitadze, a professor at the International Black Sea University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight on Primetime. Let's start with the big picture then. How significant is this then for Georgia?
Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. With your permission and permission of the distinguished audience, I would like to note that, of course, the cable project will significantly increase the transit potential of Georgia, and at the same time, of course, in this case, it will be possible to export electricity from South Caucasus, particularly from Azerbaijan through the territory of Georgia to the European. And accordingly, in this case, of course, the South region, of course, will be more integrated with European economic, geoeconomic, and with the geopolitical space of the European Union. And
Professor, we're having, with apologies to viewers, we're just having one or two connection issues with you. We're going to try and stay with you, but we may have to, unfortunately, leave this. I just want to get your view, if I may, on the relationship with the EU. The EU is clearly backing this very considerably. There haven't always been smooth relations between Tbilisi and Brussels. So how should the relationship be read, interpreted at this point?
I think that it's one of the perspectives improving the relations between European Union and Georgia by the implementation economic project, because we know how participate was some important significant for Azerbaijan for the implementation of the energy projects, Caspian energy projects, and increase export of oil and gas to the European market. I mean, Azerbaijan and gas to the European market through the territory of Georgia. And in my
Professor, I'm very sorry. We're having the same issues, I'm afraid, connecting to Tbilisi. We can't hear you very clearly. Apologies to viewers for that, and we're going to have to say thank you, and we hope to get you again next time. Okay. After the break, we'll take a closer look at protests in Slovakia over proposed voting changes and what they reveal about the country's political divide. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Protests in Slovakia are growing over a plan to scrap postal voting for citizens living abroad. Well, the government says the changes would protect ballot secrecy, but opponents say they would make it harder for the diaspora to vote. Well, thousands protested in Slovakia on Tuesday over proposed changes to election rules. The government wants to end postal voting for Slovaks abroad in parliamentary elections, requiring them to vote in person at embassies or designated polling stations. The plan would also let citizens overseas vote in presidential elections for the first time. Critics say the change would still make voting harder for many abroad, while the government says it would be better to protect ballot secrecy and reduce the risk of manipulation. Okay, joining me now to discuss this further in more detail is Zafer Mesha, who is the Berlin coordinator for CETA. Zafer, apologies for the mispronunciation of your name there. Mr. Mesha, it's very good indeed to have you on the show with us tonight. Let's start, if we could, with what we're seeing on the streets. In one sense, it looks like it's about voting rules, but in another, it also, I guess, feels bigger than that. To some degree, is this about sort of fundamental trust in the system?
Well, the trust is always a factor, not only in Slovakia in decision processes, especially when it comes to delicate election preparation, reform of election system, etc. It's not just technical. The reforms may be immediate trigger, but the scale and persistence of the protests point to, I would say, to deeper, to something deeper. A growing sense among parts of the public that the rules of the democratic game are no longer fully neutral. This is a narrative which is repeated in the opposition areas. In a polarized environment, even administrative or procedural changes are quickly interpreted as politically motivated, and that creates a feedback loop, such as low trust leads to suspicion, and suspicion further erodes trust. So what we are seeing is a broader confidence issue in democratic institutions, but not only on that. It's not just a policy dispute, I would say.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Lots of factors clearly at play. I mean, the government says this is about protecting elections. Critics say it's actually about limiting who gets to vote. How much of this do you think is political strategy?
Well, a significant part, I would say, of this is political strategy on both sides. Not on both sides. On both sides means the opposition and the government, but also the protesters on the street. There are a lot of actors there, not just one. Governments typically justify electoral reforms in terms of integrity, efficiency, or security, which are valid concerns in principle, of course, but opposition actors evaluate these same reforms in terms of their potential political effects, who benefits and who might be disadvantaged, And the real problem is that mutual trust between political camps is very low at this time. So even well-founded reforms are immediately seen through a partisan lens perspective. That means the debate is not just about the content of the reforms, but about control over the political playing fields itself. But let me just one very important issue also mention. It's important to recognize that domestic political competition does not exist in isolation. In highly interconnected political environments, external actors, whether state or non-state, can attempt to shape domestic debates through what is often described as political engineering. We know that the wordings. So this is another aspect which is not accordingly debated just now in Europe, for example.
Yes, indeed. Just stepping back a little bit, I mean, Slovakia has been seeing some growing divisions for a while now, hasn't it, over foreign policy, the media, the environment, the general sort of direction of the country. Do you think these protests are a sign that tensions are now becoming more sort of deeply entrenched?
Well, yes, and yes and no. It's a matter of more deep insights, knowledge on the dynamics which will occur in which path. You know, that's something which we will observe and see that. But and yes, that's one of the most important dynamics here. Slovakia has been experiencing gradual polarization for quite some time across foreign policy choices, you know, Russian connection, etc., trust in media and broader questions about democratic norms, but which is always on the agenda when it comes, if you criticize a country's government, then you have always on the table the democratic norms, you know, to question it. What we are seeing now is a shift from disagreement within institutions to visible sustained mobilization in the streets as well. You know, that's interesting.
Yes. Yeah, and of course there's also, adding to this, the much debated European angle. You know, relations with Brussels have been under strain for some time. Is this now part of a wider debate about sovereignty versus alignment, do you think? And just give our viewers an insight into how polarised the debate is on this issue. Is it a case of people are either vehemently pro-Brussels or vehemently anti the EU, or is there more to it, more richness, more nuance to it than that?
Well, I cannot compare with Hungary on that issue, but definitely is behavior there as well on that scene. The domestic debate is closely linked to a broader European discussion about sovereignty and integration. And in Slovakia, some political forces frame reforms as a legitimate assertion of national decision-making power as well. You know, you see from both sides, it is used for their own narratives. Others see them as a departure from the standards and expectations associated with the European Union, and particularly in areas like rule of law and institutional check and balances. I mean, I'm not categoristic on that, you know. So the protests are not only about internal governance. This is what the narrative gives. They also reflect competing visions of where Slovakia should position itself within the European political framework, I would say.
And is it easy to profile the protesters? Are we talking about predominantly young people, people from urban areas, rural areas? Is there a wide range of different people involved?
I mean, we have if we look at the civil society protest movement, so we can see that there are civic initiatives and NGOs like Peace for Ukraine or for a Decent Slovakia. These groups organize protests and mobilize public participation. They frame the issue as a defense of democracy, transparency, and European alignment. And Soros is the guy who supports some of the initiatives who are now on the streets, as I heard from a friend. And also there are general public protesters, broad and diverse coalitions, students, urban middle classes, activists, etc. The media landscape is critical. Some are pro-government and some others are independent media outlets. So I'm not very, I have not a deep knowledge on the media landscape in Slovakia, but this is the issue. We have also European and international actors. The European Commission representatives are monitoring their developments, especially regarding rule of law, judicial interdependence, etc. Foreign governments and transnational networks are also on some of them at the streets. So they add an external layer. The demonstration has indeed also an external layer, framing the issue as part of a broader European debate about democratic standards versus national sovereignty.
And finally, Mr. Mesha, I just want to get your view on what happens next. Do you think these protests will act as a catalyst for more dialogue, or do you think both sides are just far too dug into their relative positions?
Well, in the short term, probably not dramatically. It will occur, but positions on both sides are relatively entrenched, and quick compromises are at this time unlikely, I would say. However, protests can still have important indirect effects. They can reshape public narratives, influence now how legitimate political decisions are perceived, and put pressure on leaders over the time. I mean, this is a very important aspect, because we have an opposition that acts as the main institutional counterweight, but it is fragmented towards the government, which limits its ability to present a unified alternative. Progressive Slovakia, Freedom and Solidarity Party, the Christian Democratic Movement Party, they are not unified in terms of agenda, in terms of programmatic, so they have to make deals each other from case to case. And I would say the government and the ruling coalition is still has a kind of a stability, short and long, mid range, but later we can really not foresee. But I'm sure that the protesters will observe what happened in Hungary, that they feel that they have now the motivation that it can also happen in Slovakia, but I doubt it.
Mr. Mesha, very interesting indeed to speak to you. We thank you for your analysis and for joining us on Primetime tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Okay, after the break, we'll be checking in with our correspondents around the world for the very latest developments in their regions. Don't go away. A warm welcome back wherever you're watching Primetime. Let's now head to our correspondents around the world, and starting in Europe, where support for Ukraine is increasing even as the war continues to evolve. Kyiv is strengthening defence ties across the continent while Russian strikes persist on the ground. For more, AnewZ's Anita Sharma reports.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where Ukraine deepens defense ties as Russian strikes continue to hit cities on the ground. President Volodymyr Zelensky was welcomed in Berlin Tuesday with a military reception and a meeting with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Then, a number of cooperation agreements were signed on defense and reconstruction, including a large-scale joint drone production deal. Merz said the partnership would strengthen both Kyiv's war effort and Europe's defense industry, with plans to supply thousands of drones and expand air defense, including Patriot missiles and Iris-T systems. Zelensky called the drone deal potentially one of the largest in Europe, highlighting Ukraine's battlefield-driven innovation as a growing pillar of European security. Zelensky then traveled to Oslo, where a parallel deal was unveiled to co-produce Ukrainian drones both in Ukraine and Norway. Under that agreement, Kyiv will share frontline data and expertise, while Norway will boost production capacity. The Norwegian Prime Minister said Europe must learn directly from Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression. Today, Zelensky will meet the Italian Prime Minister in Rome. Giorgia Meloni has strongly backed Ukraine, but is now facing growing domestic and geopolitical pressures. This as the wider Middle East crisis drives energy and security concerns across the bloc. Meanwhile, a political shift in Hungary could unlock critical funding. After a call with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Hungary's new leader, Peter Magyar, signaled swift work ahead, raising expectations that Budapest will drop its opposition to a €90 billion EU loan for Ukraine, a key financial lifeline. But the war remains very real on the ground. Ukrainian officials say a Russian strike on the city of Dnipro killed at least 5 civilians and injured dozens. A very stark reminder that even as diplomacy accelerates, the conflict continues to exact a very heavy toll. For AnewZ, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Well, a fragile calm may be holding, but the risks remain very real. Turkey is warning that the wider conflict could still expand, even as efforts continue to stabilize the region. Adam Morrow reports now from Istanbul.
Turkish Defense Minister Yaşar Güler said there was still a risk of the regional conflict expanding, describing the ceasefire between Iran and a U.S.-Israeli military coalition as fragile but valuable. Güler was speaking during a Tuesday visit to the Turkish Joint Combined Force Command in Qatar, where he addressed Turkish troops following inspections at the base. He said Turkey welcomed the ceasefire and hoped it would become permanent, stressing that long-term stability was essential for both regional and global security. Güler said Ankara pursues a policy aimed at reducing tensions and promoting peace, adding that the presence of Turkish forces in Qatar reflects the strategic approach on the ground. Turkey has maintained a military presence in Qatar since 2015, when it established a Turkish Land Forces Command. This was followed in 2017 by the creation of a joint Turkish-Qatari Combined Force Command. Since then, Turkey has further expanded its military footprint in Doha with the creation of Naval and Air Force Commands, aimed at supporting Qatar's defense capabilities. Addressing Turkish troops, Güler noted that Qatar had been directly affected by the regional conflict, now in its second month, including exposure to missile threats. He also praised Doha's response to the war, describing it as calm, determined, and constructive. During his visit to the small Persian Gulf state, Güler held a separate meeting with Qatar's Minister of Endowments and Islamic Affairs, Ghanem ben Shaheen ben Ghanem Al Ghanem. Güler concluded by stressing that Ankara's objective was a stronger and more effective military capable of ensuring regional peace and deterrence. This is Adam Morrow for AnewZ in Istanbul, Turkey.
Iran confirms indirect contact with Washington through intermediaries as mediation efforts build. Key questions remain over a ceasefire extension and the next steps in a tense and uncertain standoff. Touraj Shirililo brings us more from Tehran.
Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Ismail Baghai said Tehran expects a delegation from Pakistan to discuss mediation between Iran and the United States. Speaking at a weekly press conference, he confirmed that Tehran and Washington are exchanging messages through intermediaries, including Pakistan. The spokesman, however, did not announce a date or venue for upcoming negotiations and whether or not the ceasefire between Iran, US, and Israel will be extended. He also expressed Iran's satisfaction over the fact that regional as well as European countries did not join the US blockade of Iranian ports, which he termed Washington's trap for escalation in the conflict. To a question, Baghai welcomed the remarks by IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi, saying there was no evidence of military aspect in Iran's civilian nuclear program. However, he was quick to reiterate Tehran's criticism of Grossi's earlier positions and remarks. The Iranian spokesman urged the regional countries to stop hosting US bases which were used in the US aggression of Iran in violation of international law. To a query on the US economic overtures, the Iranian foreign ministry spokesman said Tehran does not trust the rhetoric which contradicts actions. Touraj Shirililo, reporting from Iranian Foreign Ministry, Tehran, for AnewZ.
Sanctions on Taliban leaders remain firmly in place with no change to the restrictions themselves. The UN has updated its listings, but Kabul is pushing back, arguing the measures are ineffective and calling for engagement instead. Tamim Bahis has more now from Kabul.
The United Nations Security Council has announced updates to its sanctions list involving senior Taliban officials, including Prime Minister Mohammad Hassan Nakhwan, Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs Mullah Abdul Ghani brother, Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi, and Mines and Petroleum Minister Hidayatullah Badri. According to the announcement, the changes mainly concern identity information, past official positions, and locations of residence, but the core penalties remain unchanged. Those names are still subject to international travel bans, arm embargoes, and asset freezes under existing UN sanctions. Reacting to the development, Afghan government spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid told Afghanistan's national broadcasters RTA that sanctions and restrictions have been ineffective from the start. He described the measures as unjust and said they violate the rights of Afghans. Mujahid argued that when sanctions are placed on the head of an institution, the impacts extend beyond individuals, affecting the wider institution and ultimately the Afghan people. He also said the Islamic Emirate wants greater understanding with the international community and called on United Nations to promote engagement with Afghanistan rather than apply what he described as political pressure. These sanctions are part of a long-standing UN framework targeting Taliban leaders and key officials. Since the Taliban returned to power in 2021, international recognition has remained limited, with sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and human rights concerns continuing to shape Afghanistan's relationship with the wider world. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, AnewZ.
A record has been set, but the ambition runs deeper. Uzbekistan's new Centre on Islamic Civilization is now the largest of its kind, combining heritage, research, and a wider push to elevate its cultural influence globally. Savil Rajapova sent us this report from Tashkent.
The Center of Islamic Civilization in Uzbekistan has been awarded a Guinness World Records title as the largest museum dedicated to Islamic civilization, following a formal verification process. The recognition was confirmed by adjudicator Sheida Subashi Dimichi, who highlighted the uniqueness and cultural value of each exhibit. The complex was initiated in 2017 under the leadership of Shavkat Mirziyoyev and completed in March 2026. Designed as a scientific, educational, and cultural hub, it combines historical artifacts with modern technologies to present the contributions of Islamic civilization to global development. According to officials, the scale and depth of the project position Uzbekistan as an active participant in global cultural dialogue. Chief architect Abdukahor Turdiev noted that the design reflects the country's rich historical legacy, while also aligning with contemporary approach to museum development. The center has quickly become one of the most visited cultural sites in the region, attracting up to 5,000 visitors daily. The center spans 10 hectares within the Hazrati Imam complex, with a total usable area exceeding 42,000 square meters. Among its most valuable exhibits are more than 100 rare manuscripts of the Quran, including the renowned Usman Quran listed in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. The collection also includes unique artifacts such as a gold pictorial from the Amu Darya treasure, rare manuscripts from the various Islamic dynasties, and historical objects reflecting centuries of scientific, cultural, and artistic development across the region. It is Savil Rajapova reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, AnewZ.
Economic ties between Kazakhstan and Turkey are strengthening, with trade and investment both on the rise. As new projects move forward and high-level visits approach, the partnership is entering a more expansive phase. Fariza Kalamazina has the details now from Almaty.
Trade turnover between Kazakhstan and Turkey increased by 9% in 2025 amid the continued expansion of economic and investment ties between the two countries. This was announced by Kazakhstan's Prime Minister Oljas Bektenov at the 14th meeting of the Kazakhstan-Turkey Intergovernmental Commission. He said Kazakhstan's exports rose by more than 17%, reaching $3.9 billion. The government plans to continue working with the Turkish side to diversify exports, moving away from raw materials toward higher value-added products. Investment cooperation remains one of the main drivers of bilateral relations. Since 2005, more than $6 billion of Turkish investment have been attracted into Kazakhstan's economy. Over the past year alone, inflows amounted to around $390 million. Today, more than 5,000 companies with Turkish capital operate in the country. In total, Kazakhstan and Turkey have implemented 98 joint investment projects valued at around $4 billion, while another 50 projects valued at $3.9 billion are currently underway. Kazakhstan says it's ready to provide industrial sites and state support tools for new joint initiatives. In this context, a state visit by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is scheduled for Kazakhstan in May. Officials say the visit will give fresh momentum to bilateral cooperation. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, AnewZ.
Tensions over Taiwan are once again in focus, with China firmly rejecting US accusations of military pressure. Well, Beijing insists its actions are routine, while warning against what it sees as external interference. For more, we head to Manor Makdoum, who is in Beijing.
China has strongly rejected recent US claims that it is exerting military pressures on Taiwan, calling the allegations a distortion of facts, driven by what Beijing describes as malicious intentions. A spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office, Chen Binhua, stressed that Taiwan is an internal matter for China and warned against external interference. He said that China's military activities around the island are routine and necessary steps to safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Beijing reaffirmed that peaceful reunification remains its preferred direction, emphasizing that closer cross-strait integration would bring clear economic and social benefits to the people of Taiwan, including improved livelihoods and development opportunities. China also reiterated its firm opposition to U.S. armed sales to Taiwan, describing them as a destabilizing factor that undermines peace and trust in the region. The remarks follow recent U.S. calls for Beijing to reduce military activity and engage in dialogue with Taiwan, which China dismissed as interference in its internal affairs. Despite differences, Chinese officials continue to highlight openness to constructive engagement based on peaceful development, while maintaining that national reunification is a historic and inevitable process. Manu Mathum, AnewZ, Beijing.
And now for some more top stories from around the world. The Azerbaijan Airlines tragedy is now moving into a phase of formal closure. Azerbaijan and Russia have agreed terms following the downing of the passenger jet, with compensation settled and the circumstances acknowledged.
Azerbaijan and Russia have reached a formal settlement over the crash of an Azerbaijan Airlines passenger jet in December 2024. The agreement was confirmed in a joint statement issued by both countries' foreign ministries. Officials say all outstanding issues have now been resolved, including compensation payments to the victims' families. The statement acknowledges that the aircraft was brought down by the unintentional action of a Russian air defense system while flying in Russian airspace. The settlement follows talks between the presidents of the two countries held in Dushanbe in October 2025. Both sides say the agreement reflects a commitment to maintaining close cooperation and strengthening ties based on mutual respect. The ministries also renewed their condolences, describing the crash as an irreparable loss. The Embraer 190 aircraft had been traveling from Baku to Grozny when it was hit during its approach. Severely damaged, the pilots attempted to divert and make an emergency landing, but the plane crashed near Aktau in Kazakhstan. There were 67 people on board. 38 were killed, while 29 survived.
Talks between the United States and Iran could be back on within days. After a collapse in negotiations and a blockade now in place, attention is shifting to whether diplomacy can recover from a very fragile position.
US President Donald Trump said on Tuesday that talks with Iran could resume in Pakistan within the next 2 days. This follows the collapse of weekend negotiations, which led Washington to impose a blockade on Iranian ports. US Vice President J.D. Vance also pointed to progress, but said deep mistrust between Washington and Tehran would take time to overcome.
Look, honestly, after 49 years, there's a lot of course, mistrust between Iran and the United States of America. You're not going to solve that problem overnight. But yeah, I think the people we're sitting across from wanted to make a deal, and I know the President of the United States told us to go out there and negotiate in good faith. That's what we did. That's what we're going to keep on doing. So you never know, though.
He added that Iranian negotiators appeared willing to reach an agreement and said he felt very good about where we are. Iran has not yet responded to Trump's remarks. Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said the country remains compliant with international law and highlighted growing instability in the Middle East.
There is now a problem in the Persian Gulf, and the world has been thrown into turmoil. This has had an impact across the world. People are dissatisfied and have raised their voices. But we ourselves are in the midst of this turmoil, and despite all these pressures, our work is progressing properly.
The comments come as the US military said no ships had passed through the American-enforced blockade of Iranian ports and coastal areas in the first 24 hours of the operation. Lastly, the US-sanctioned tanker Rich Starry made its way back to the Strait of Hormuz on Wednesday after exiting the Gulf the day before, shipping data showed, failing to break through a US blockade on vessels calling at Iranian ports. The Chinese-owned tanker was among at least 8 ships crossing the waterway on Tuesday, the first day of the US blockade. Shipping data showed that it made a U-turn on Tuesday.
4 people, including 3 students and a teacher, have been killed and at least 20 others injured in a shooting at a middle school in Turkey, authorities have said. Officials said the attacker later shot himself following the incident. The motive remains unknown as investigations continue. Well, the attack marks the second school shooting reported in the country in recent days. Japan plans a $10 billion financial framework to help Asian countries secure energy supplies as conflict in the Middle East increases competition for oil. Well, the support will be channeled through state-backed institutions to protect regional supply chains and Japan's own economy. Southeast Asian nations have smaller oil reserves, raising concerns over shortages of key industrial materials. The plan is also linked to a wider regional effort on energy transition and resilience.
Through such framework, supporting supply chains across Asian countries will directly contribute to strengthening Japan's economy. These efforts will also advance the Asia Zero Emission Community, which aims to simultaneously achieve energy security, economic growth and decarbonisation by adding a focus on economic and energy resilience.
Pope Leo has left Algeria, where he criticised violations of international law by what he called neo-colonial powers. Now he is heading to Cameroon, continuing a 10-day tour across 4 African countries. Now he's expected to call for peace in the country's English-speaking regions, where a long-running conflict has killed thousands. The Pope will meet President Paul Biya in Yaoundé before travelling to Bamenda and Douala, where hundreds of thousands are expected to attend a major open-air mass. Well, the trip spans nearly 18,000 kilometres and also includes visits to Angola and Equatorial Guinea. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continues his European tour with a visit to Norway. Today he visited Parliament in Oslo and met Crown Prince Haakon following high-level talks the night before. Zelensky and Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store signed a new defence and cooperation agreement aimed at strengthening military ties. Well, the deal includes joint drone production, with Norway supporting manufacturing in Ukraine, while Kyiv provides battlefield data and operational expertise. Zelensky is now heading to Italy, where he is expected to meet Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni later today. Okay, let's turn our attention now to the African continent. Angola has been experiencing severe flooding, damaging a key railway line, disrupting transport and affecting a major route for mineral exports.
Floodwaters have damaged sections of the Lobito railway corridor in Angola, forcing a suspension of operations after rivers burst their banks following heavy rains. Water rushed over rail lines, with tracks twisted and broken. The Lobito Atlantic Railway says flooding hit bridges over the Halo River between Cubal and Caimbambo, as well as a crossing over the Cavaco River near Benguela. By Monday, floodwaters were still flowing through communities, with homes inundated and belongings washed away. One resident described the scale of the destruction.
It's a tragedy. Other people were at the Cavaco wall, and by the time we realized it, the metal bridge had already collapsed. Then we got scared when the water started rising onto the deck and flooding our houses like rafts. As it reached our homes, many things were lost, rice, everything. There's no way to explain it.
The railway is a critical export route, carrying copper and cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo to the Atlantic port of Lobito and transporting goods in the opposite direction.
A small chapel in Kenya is capturing attention far beyond its size. Well, as the Pope tours Africa, locals are hoping for a visit that could inspire faith and strengthen ties with the Vatican.
On the slopes of Kenya's Great Rift Valley, a small Catholic chapel is drawing fresh attention as Pope Leo XIV tours Africa. The Maimahiu Catholic Church, also called the Traveler's Chapel, measures just 15 by 8 feet and seats only 12 people. Locals hope the Pope may visit and believe that a papal prayer would bring comfort during difficult times in Kenya.
I'd like him to visit our Kenya, our country, because he may say a word or a prayer. Because now in Kenya we have so many things going on. So when he comes in Africa, let him come in Kenya. And we even would like to see him.
The most I could expect from him is just prayers. Because the last time Pope Francis was here in Kenya, he offered a mass. And lots of people went there. So I just hope if the current Pope visits Kenya, maybe he can do the same, maybe a mass for the Catholics who live in Kenya.
Today, the church offers visitors a quiet place for prayer, away from busy city life. The chapel was built in 1942 by Italian prisoners of war. In Nairobi, religious leaders are hopeful for stronger ties with the Vatican.
More than 25 million insecticide-treated nets will be distributed across Uganda as the country steps up its fight against malaria. This comes as officials express concern over rising cases amongst children under the age of 5.
Uganda is intensifying efforts to combat malaria with what it describes as its largest mosquito net distribution campaign to date. The initiative will see more than 25 million insecticide-treated nets rolled out in phases, focusing on regions with the highest infection rates. Officials say the use of nets can reduce malaria transmission by up to 50%.
Among the most effective prevention measures is the use of long-lasting insecticide-treated mosquito nets. We all know that when mosquito nets are used properly, these nets can break the malaria transmission by 50%. They can also reduce on morbidity and mortality by 25%.
Health teams have already begun distributing the nets, particularly in northern and eastern areas, where in some communities malaria transmission among children under 5 has reached as high as 13%. At the same time, global funding for malaria programs has declined, putting years of progress at risk. Uganda had reduced malaria prevalence among children under 5 from 45% in 2009 to nearly 10% in 2018, but the rise to 13% is now raising concerns. Officials are also calling for faster treatment, as data points to significant gaps in early detection and timely care.
We would like to pay more attention to encouraging Ugandans to ensure that they seek treatment after they have been tested from the recognized health facilities. We would also like to pay more attention to addressing issues of malaria in pregnancy among women.
Uganda remains among the top 10 countries with the highest malaria burden, with more than half of malaria deaths in 2025 occurring among children under 5. Authorities hope the campaign will protect vulnerable communities and help get the country back on track to eliminate malaria by 2030.
A new trade deal between South Africa and China could reshape the citrus market. Well, the agreement is expected to cut export costs and keep fruit on the shelves year-round. Here's more.
South Africa's citrus industry is set for a major boost after a new trade agreement with China. The updated protocol eases key treatment rules for citrus exports. It follows close technical work between officials from both countries. The changes are expected to lower costs and improve access to the Chinese market. China is already a strong market for South African citrus, especially navel oranges, lemons and grapefruit.
South Africa fruit industry is very mature. In some area, it's a world-class advance. You know how to prevent sanitary, biosafety, and you know how to keep fresh of your fruit. So we have more confidence to South Africa management of this international trade.
Officials say the timing is important, as South Africa supplies fruit during China's off-season. This helps keep citrus available to consumers all year.
This is also important because from the 1st of May, we are going to have zero tariff access to the Chinese market. And that is going to be a game changer for agriculture, particularly in South Africa, where there's a huge demand for South African agricultural products, given our counter-cyclical and counter-seasonal benefit, and because the Chinese market is a massive market. And so deepening and widening trade to China is a fundamental part of our strategy going into the future.
Authorities in Pretoria and Beijing say the deal will strengthen agricultural ties, and it confirms China as a key trading partner for South Africa's fruit industry.
Well, that brings us to the end of tonight's Prime Time. Please do join us again tomorrow for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here at AnewZ, thanks for watching.